Welcome to the podcast of the Consortium for History of Science, Technology, and Medicine.
And welcome David and Sara with us for today's session on oral history. So just briefly, last time we said something about the DHST and we said something about the commissions. All we wanted to point out here is that the DHST is kind of the global spanning organization in history of science and technology. And it's for you as well, if you attend as a younger scholar, it could be an option to just search for a commission that fits your interest and the topics and the fields that you address, and try to get in touch with the people by registering on newsletter. If you don't find anything, just go and send an email. Also here, again, be proactive to get in touch with people, because often what commissions do is organize panels and conferences, or even organize conferences. So in the future, if you have a paper to present, this could be a very good forum to make yourself and your research known to a broader audience. So we really encourage you to get in touch with commissions of the DHST. That's what they are for.
Thank you everyone for coming to the second session of our workshops. Just a little bit more on these commissions. The commissions also, the Commission for History and Philosophy of Physics and the Commission Science and Diplomacy, for example, they have a prize contest for early career historians. So it's also an opportunity for you to promote your research and to learn more about the research of the early career historians in your field. So I'm sure you'll find very interesting commissions. Please then visit the DHST website and get engaged. Our workshop is being organized in this platform of the Consortium for History and Philosophy of Science and Technology Medicine, for History of Science, Technology, Medicine. And here you'll find the information about every meeting, as well as materials for reading materials and the videos that will be posting of each of the sections.
So now this is David Zierler and Sara Baum. They join us from far away, I would say, from my view in California. So thanks for getting up so early in the morning. And the reason we invited them is because they are very renowned, I would say, in oral history interviews and analysis. And this is the topic they're going to talk about. So thanks for being with us and giving a presentation and sharing your insights and experience with those who join us here.
Well, thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you very much, Clamario, and everyone at DHST. And thank you, everyone, for joining today. Let's first introduce ourselves. I'm David Zierler. I'm the Ronald and Maxine Linde Director of the Caltech Heritage Project and Senior Strategist at the California Institute of Technology. And my colleague and partner in a million different ways is Sara Baum. Sara is the owner of Sharp Copy Transcription, and we have together done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of oral histories across a range of projects, across a range of end uses. And we were delighted when Barbara reached out and asked for us to share a little bit about our experiences. So personally, let me just start at a broad level. I have been conducting oral histories since I was a graduate student over 20 years ago, and I have lost count, but I am nearing, or I have passed, something like 1,000 oral histories. So I think I've picked up a few things along the way, and I want to perhaps start first with a disclaimer that even though the title of our presentation is Best Practices in Oral History, Interviewing, and Analysis, I and Sara together collectively, we are only representing our own views. There are lots and lots and lots of different opinions about best practices. There are lots of different approaches. There are several wonderful online guides to best practices in oral history, interviewing, and analysis. And there's no right or wrong answer. There's no formula that you can plug into to ensure success. What I would say is that at the most fundamental level, it's about establishing a human connection. The really beautiful and unique aspect to oral history interviewing as a historical methodology is that it's you interacting with a fellow human being. It's not you interacting with a book or an article or something obviously that's not alive. You're establishing a human connection. And first and foremost, if you have a genuine intellectual interest in the person that you're talking to and a sincere curiosity about their experiences, their perspective, their wisdom, then you will have a successful discussion with them toward producing a relevant record for your larger follow-on history discussion. When you have a genuine intellectual curiosity, I think that is foundational to being comfortable first with yourself. What I mean by that is if you are comfortable with yourself in that setting, if you come prepared with a general idea of the kinds of questions you want to ask with the intent to have an enjoyable and meaningful and free-flowing conversation, then the interviewee also will feel comfortable, and that will yield the most productive and useful conversation that you can possibly have. The key distinction there, I would say, is that an oral history discussion differs from a journalistic interview in the sense that it's not nearly as rigid and bounded. You don't come in necessarily with perfectly preformed questions in mind. I would say that you should absolutely come in thematically prepared with the kinds of topics that you want to discuss, but you absolutely need to come in open to the possibility, even the likelihood, that the conversation is going to veer and meander in ways that you could not see coming. And that's sort of the whole fun and adventure of oral history, that it should be surprising to you. But again, if you come in prepared, if you come in comfortable, then those surprises, those meanderings, makes for a much more productive and revealing discussion. So at the most basic level, that's what I would say is applicable no matter what stage you are in your own career, no matter what you intend to do with the oral history transcript that you have produced, no matter who it is that you're speaking to. I would say that, my experience over all of my years doing these oral histories, this is something that is applicable no matter who it is that you talk to. So let me first start with a little personal biography of how I got into oral history completely by accident, and it will crescendo with how I met Sara in 2019 and what we have accomplished together ever since. So let me start first in graduate school, and I did not know that oral history was a thing. I had no idea. So I was enrolled in a graduate PhD program in history, and the topic that I had settled on for my dissertation research was the use of Agent Orange in Vietnam. So very briefly, Agent Orange is the most infamous chemical combination of a range of defoliation chemicals that were used in Vietnam by the Kennedy and then Johnson and then Nixon administration in an effort to strip the jungle cover of the South Vietnamese and Ho Chi Minh Trail forests so that the insurgency in Vietnam would be robbed of its primary tactical and strategic advantage, which was the rainforest cover. So the idea is that in order to counter an insurgency that uses the forest to mount sneak attacks for sniping and things like that, you use chemical defoliants to destroy the jungle, to basically destroy the rainforest of South Vietnam and the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The chemical science behind Agent Orange and other defoliants was developed by a group of scientists working for the United States in the 1940s, many of whom, when they learned that it was being used not for agriculture, which was the purpose, which was the point of it being used. You need it for agriculture because it basically is a very efficient way of selecting the capacity to kill plants that you don't want, undesirable plants, which we call weeds, which leaves unharmed the plants that we do want, which are, of course, crops. So in the 1940s and 1950s, this was celebrated as a major advance in the capacity to feed an ever-growing world population. And the scientists were quite pleased and proud with what they had accomplished when they learned that it was going to be used for offensive purposes in a war whose wisdom many questioned, even early in the 1960s, and which, of course, exploded into massive anti-war sentiment by the end of the 1960s. The protest against Agent Orange, the protest against the ecocide, the willful destruction of environments and the people who live and depend on those environments, became a major political initiative, a major development in the United States, internationally, in the late 1960s. And so when I began my dissertation research, my focus, my idea, my plan was that it was going to be sort of a traditional Cold War national security kind of research project, where I would focus on strategy and diplomacy and decision-making and things like that. But then when I realized that a lot of the scientists who were becoming more and more prominent in the narrative that I was building, they were alive, I realized, hey, this is an amazing opportunity just to be able to speak to them in real life. And I established contact first with Arthur Galston, who was formerly the chair of the biology program at Yale University in Connecticut in the United States. And I took a train up and I met with him. And in the course of that conversation, I thought to myself, let me get a recorder. Let me bring a recorder because I might want to have not just the notes that I take at the time, but a recording of our discussion. And as I was speaking to him, the sort of idea rushed over me that I think what I'm doing, without anybody telling me, was I think I'm doing oral history. And so that was the first inkling that I had. There was this whole world of oral history out there. There was a community of people, of historians, who use oral history as a core historical methodology for whatever academic narrative project that they're working on, and that I can plug into this community. So from that first discussion with Arthur Galston, I talked to more and more scientists, and I realized that I now had a passion that I never knew I had, a capacity to talk to scientists about their science. And so I finished my dissertation. I revised it into a book, which you can see on the screen here. And I thought of myself following the successful completion of the thesis, the publication of the book. I had sort of reformulated my professional identity from an academic historian whose goal was to go and to become a professor at university as a historian of science who does oral history, into what I did become, which was an institutional historian. So after my thesis, after my postdoctoral appointment, I joined the Office of the Historian at the United States Department of State. U.S. Department of State Office of the Historian employs, or I should say employed, I'm sort of afraid to find out what the status of my former colleagues is right now, given all of the dislocations that are happening in the United States, literally as we speak. But as far as I know, the Office of the Historian continues to be a wonderful organization that does two main things. It declassifies documents and publishes them into edited anthologies. This is an example of one that I have edited. And it also provides policy support from a historical perspective on a range of initiatives that policymakers rely on for historical perspective and policymaking. So at the State Department, I did primarily national security declassification policy analysis, but whenever I saw the opportunity, I involved myself in historical initiatives that were scientific in nature, and also just the way that I realized that there were living scientists that I could speak to for my thesis research, wherever possible in an unclassified setting, to talk to historical actors who could help me shed light on the backstory of a given document or the broader context of a decision that was made. I employed the same sort of the oral history techniques that I developed as a graduate student during my time at the Department of State. So I worked at the Department of State from 2008 until 2019. And then after a certain point, I wanted to become sort of more connected with the passion that I developed in graduate school. I wanted to be more connected with the world of oral history and with history of science. And that's when I took a position at the American Institute of Physics. So AIP, American Institute of Physics, is located in College Park, Maryland. It is an umbrella organization that does a few things. First and foremost, administratively, as in all branches of science, physics is subdivided into subfields, and each of those subfields in physics has their own scientific society. So condensed matter, particle physics, vacuum physics, meteorology, they all have their own specialized scientific societies, and each of those societies is not big enough to be a standalone organization administratively, and so that they fit in into the umbrella organization that is the American Institute of Physics. AIP also publishes Physics Today, which is the glossy flagship magazine of the American physics community. And most germane to my work, AIP also is home to the Niels Bohr Library. The Niels Bohr Library is the largest physics library in the world, and it contains an oral history collection. It is a remarkable, beautiful oral history collection that goes all the way back to the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. And you can learn about, obviously, not just physics internationally, but the histories of the physicists who tell their story. So in 2019, I joined the American Institute of Physics as director of the oral history program, not having a background in physics. The science that I did pick up for my graduate research was in plant genetics and plant physiology. So it was a little nervous for me to start to talk about a new subject for which I knew very little, but I relied on, the experiences that I developed, just being able and feeling very comfortable talking to scientists. Now, in November 2019, when I joined AIP, the world that I inhabited, the world that most of historians inhabited in 2019, was the pre-Zoom world. And so my modus operandi going into AIP was that I would be doing a lot of traveling, because living in Washington, D.C., there are only so many physicists that you could speak to locally. And so I assumed that I would be doing a lot of traveling around the country, perhaps even around the world, because I associated oral history with being an in-person process. I was not even aware that video conferencing was an option. And of course, that awareness came to me in February 2020. We all know what happens then. COVID hits. And in the first few weeks, this was my experience, if anybody can relate, In the first few weeks of the pandemic, the idea was, oh, okay, this is bad, but it should pass in about 2 weeks. So we'll see everyone in 2 weeks and try to be productive, and we'll be back in the office then. And during those 2 weeks, I thought to myself, okay, I'm home. What can I do to sort of keep productive and keep things interesting and move things along? And one of the news stories that was concerning to me, obviously beyond all of the horrors of the pandemic as it was unfolding, was that with social distancing, senior citizens, elderly people were experiencing difficulty because of social isolation. And so I thought to myself, okay, well, how about I connect with some elderly physicists, and that would be a nice thing. It would be good for my work, for my project. It would be a nice gesture to connect with them and to alleviate some of the isolation that they were feeling. And then I thought, we can't do this in person, obviously. Phone is not so great because you see them, you can't see their face, you can't fully interact. And then I heard about this thing called Zoom. And so before Zoom, there was Skype, but Skype usually was associated with like a poor internet connection and it was choppy. But thank goodness by, the spring of 2020, internet was good enough. Zoom is this amazing new technology. And it's one that I sort of dipped my toe in and thought like, okay, let's see how well this works. My plan was I emailed a bunch of senior physicists who are sort of well connected in the physics world, college presidents, former cabinet secretaries, directors of national labs, leading figures in the world of physics who know physicists who have a good historical perspective. And I asked several of them, okay, for these 2 weeks, who's going to be available? Who would be around that you would be interested in conducting and seeing an oral history that I would conduct? I got a lot of enthusiastic responses from that. And I started reaching out and I started conducting oral history interviews with senior physicists. And we all know what happens next. Those initial 2 weeks turned into a pandemic that lasted however long that you want to count it. I never went back into the office during my time at AIP for the next 18 months. I was completely remote at AIP, and I conducted about 500 interviews with eminent physicists. I was greatly honored to have spoken with nearly every living Nobel Prize winner in physics, university presidents, as many of the, history-making physicists who were alive and willing to talk with me. And over the course of doing all of these interviews, I got connected to Sara Baum. Sara was already working as a contractor for AIP, and we established an immediate connection. I was really impressed with Sara's organizational management, her fast turnaround, her capacity to answer all of my questions, to organize everything, to make everything as smooth as possible. And when I went on to my next position at the California Institute of Technology, I knew that there was only one way that I was going to be able to do that, and that was if I took Sara with me. So let me just pause right here and talk a little bit about the depth of the professional relationship that I've built with Sara, because this is going to be relevant for those of you who are interested in pursuing oral history as intensively as I have. But I also want to specifically address the kinds of questions about like, what about if I'm just looking to do oral history sort of as a one-off? So I want to address both of those things. I know one of the questions in the chat already is, how can we utilize artificial intelligence, AI transcription, depending on the scope of the project? So I want to address all of those things. So let me first say that what I do is completely a a 50-50 partnership with Sara. And when I came to Caltech, I came with the idea that I would become Caltech's institutional historian and I would pursue the history of Caltech, which is an amazing science and technology research institute, and I would do it from the perspective of oral history interviewing based on my bedrock belief that institutional history, meaning the history of an institution, is a history of its people, but it's more than a collection of biographies. It's that the sum total of those biographies tells you something really profound about the institution itself, where the sum of those biographies are greater than their constituent parts. So from AIP to Caltech, Sara and I have developed a workflow where you can sort of think about it as front end and back end. So on the front end, I am the one who is thinking about who do I want to conduct an oral history interview with? What is the larger purpose of doing that oral history? In other words, if I'm talking to Professor so-and-so, or I'm talking to alumnus so-and-so, why am I doing that? Is it part of a larger project? Is it part of a book project? Am I developing a theme that would be relevant for an article? Would it be relevant for an artistic display? Would it be relevant for a conference, for a documentary? Because the idea is that oral histories, in my view, they are both standalone historical records. In other words, you conduct an oral history with an individual, and the transcript from there is then edited by the interviewee, released, and it goes out into the public. Or it's an and/or situation, or that historical record, that oral history transcript, can be used for some additional or follow-on project. So let's talk a little bit now about the workflow that Sara and I have developed. And the theme you'll hear from this, I hope, is that what I do with Sara could never be achieved with an AI program. So here's how it would work. Let's say I am working on a new project. Let's say that, here's a real life example. The provost of Caltech comes to me and says, we're going to do a symposium on the history of chemical biology at Caltech, the development of chemical biology as a discrete field. Okay, those are my marching orders. So in addition to me now reading up about the science, the development of the history of chemical biology, my task now is to go and find the practitioners who made this field happen. The professors at Caltech, their colleagues elsewhere, the alumni who have come through the program, and I'm going to talk to, let's say, 50 of them. So here's how it works. I am going to write an email to Professor, let's say, Peter Dervin, who's one of the founders of chemical biology. I'm going to explain to him the nature of the larger project, but I'm also going to emphasize that I'm not just interested in talking to Professor Dervin because of his contributions to this field. I'm going to talk to Professor Dervin because I'm interested in his life and where his scientific achievements fit into a life narrative. And so the thing to emphasize here, and the thing to go all the way back to the beginning of my comments, is one of the most important factors in creating a successful, usable oral history transcript is to communicate clearly to the interviewee what your goals are. And my strong belief is that oral history, again, as opposed to journalistic interviewing, where you're just sort of like in an interview, in a journalistic interview, you're sort of just going in and you're asking a question to extract some piece of information from an individual. Oral history really needs to come from the perspective where you are fascinated by not just the expertise that brings you to the interviewee, but that you want to contextualize. This is why it's history. This is why oral history, in my view, is so much deeper and in many ways arguably more meaningful than rigid, preformed journalistic style questions, is that you want to extract the expert level questions about the topic that you're interested in. So again, to go back to Peter Dervin and the history of chemical biology, you want to get the answers about the history of chemical biology from the larger narrative of Peter Dervin's life. Why is that so important? Even if you want to be cynical and say, I don't really care about Peter Dervin's life, and I hope you're not, but even if you were, you're going to get so much more out of Peter Dervin if you get him to talk about the development of his science in the form of storytelling. Because here's the key point in the successful oral history interview. If you make people feel important, and I don't mean important like inflate their sense of ego or something like that, but if you convey to them a genuine curiosity, and I think this is why people become historians, a genuine curiosity about their lived experience, you will get the narrative of their scientific greatness or whatever the achievements are that you're trying to extract, if they feel like they're going to explain it as a narrative series of events as they actually lived and experienced it. So before we get to the great Peter Dervin and all of the prizes he's won and all of the accolades he's received and all the papers that he's been cited in and all of that, if you get the story of where did Peter grow up, how did he become interested in science, who were the mentors that sparked his imagination, what were the trials and errors and difficulties and tribulations that he overcame to create his dissertation topic, what was his mindset when he was a young assistant professor, who challenged him, how did he attract students to work with him? What were the things that he was reading in other journals where he saw an opportunity to make his own mark? Once you get a person talking about the narrative of their life, you're going to get far richer answers about the initial thing that is most interesting to you and that can be extracted for whatever that follow-on project is. Meaning that if I just went to Peter Dervin and I said, tell me about all of your achievements in chemical biology, the quality of that answer would be much, much lower than the quality of the answer that's contextualized around the entirety of Peter's life story. And so that's why, for me, when you're talking to somebody who has lived a long life and has a lot of perspective, the goal is not sort of just a one-off conversation. It's a series of conversations that can last, I have found that 90 minutes, whether it's in Zoom or it's in person, is about the sweet spot of it's long enough where you can really get into the nature of the discussion before exhaustion sets in, and then you come back to the next one. So the way that I do it for my longer oral histories is the first session is always, tell me about the big themes of your career. What are you interested in? What are the big questions? What are the technologies that you've used? What's the interplay between theory and experiment? And again, this can be applied. It doesn't matter if you're talking to a scientist, you're talking to a war veteran, you're talking to a teacher, a nurse, a lawyer, whoever it is that you're talking about. If you start the questions with the sort of big narrative overview, that both orients the reader of the transcription and it makes both the interviewer and interviewee comfortable about the nature of the topics that you're going to discuss. And then in subsequent interview sessions, that's where I sort of revert to a standard narrative chronological biography of family background, childhood, educational trajectory that goes all the way into one's professional career. My view is that oral histories sort of naturally end when they're supposed to end, when both the interviewer and interviewee kind of feel that they have completed the entirety of the story. And so let me get now into a bit of the process once the series of discussions is over. So I've reached out to the potential interviewee. I've done it in a way where I hope to make them feel comfortable. I assure them, this is a key point. Sara has pulled up here the release form that we use. As opposed to a podcast where you're just recording things live, and that sort of is what it is. I always assure interviewees that my goal as an oral historian, my goal as a historian of science, is creating a historical record that is maximally accurate according to the interviewee. Meaning that unless there is something that I specifically feel needs to be fact-checked, the fact-checking is done by the expert, and the expert is, of course, the interviewee. So what we do is I record all of the sessions on a external device. That's my trusty Tascam digital recorder there. I upload it to a shared file, any, Dropbox, Google, whatever platform that you want. Sara then takes those recordings and she does her magic and produces a draft Word transcript. And maybe at the end, Sara can talk a little bit about her process of transforming an audio recording into a transcript, the software that she uses, the team of contractors that she relies on to produce the transcripts. I'll just say right at the outset, this was true 6 years ago when I started with this, and it's certainly true now. Artificial intelligence transcription, I would spend as much time correcting AI mistakes as I would in investing the time and resources in the human transcription that Sara provides. So that is my ongoing ringing endorsement for human transcription, obviously, and I say that from the perspective of I have the resources available to do that, and I acknowledge that many people, certainly students, do not. Sara turns the audio recordings into a draft transcript. That draft transcript then goes back to the interviewee, and I assure them that they have full editorial control to make both substantive changes and minor changes to the document. I encourage them not to edit so intrusively because people are, and if anybody, has experienced this, one of the universal responses when people get the draft transcript is, oh my God, I cannot believe how inchoate I sounded. I cannot believe, how my answers were so disjointed and I was circular and things like that. And the standard response I give, which is always sincere, is that it's the textual version of how we respond when we hear our own voices, right? We hear our own voices in our brains as we're speaking very differently than a recording of our voices, where it's always when we hear ourselves, it's like, my God, I sound like that. This is the textual version for that. And the reason for that is that people, particularly scholars, are very used to seeing their written voice. They're very used to seeing their prose. And prose, of course, is highly edited and it's highly polished. But what is oral history? Oral history is extemporaneous, it's spontaneous, it should be fun, it should be going back to, there should be random walks, you should be able to meander, you should be able to explore all kinds of topics and return to them and repeat yourself if things are important. So it's really just capturing a fun conversation. And so what I try to do is I encourage interviewees to embrace the uniqueness of oral history, that it's not written prose, that it's a wonderful opportunity for people to engage or people to see or feel or read what the human being is like. So a scientist writing a scientific paper in a journal, you don't see who the person is behind that writing. In an oral history, if it's done properly, you absolutely do. So I encourage interviewees not to edit so intrusively that extemporaneous conversation starts to look like highly edited prose. But I do encourage them, wherever they see the opportunity, to make a point a little more clear, to clarify something that might be confusing, to add additional facts or make something more accurate. They're most welcome to do so. Why? Because my goal is that when this historical record becomes releasable by the interviewee, it goes into the archive. If they've released the audio, it goes to I put them all up on my YouTube page. You could listen to the audio podcast style if the interviewee feels comfortable, if they haven't said anything that's sensitive, that cannot be deleted, because of course I don't delete anything in audio. We just edit in the document itself. My goal is that at the end of this, this is something that goes into an archive where, you know, a podcast, who knows how long a podcast is going to be available on a particular digital platform. My goal is that the written version of these transcripts goes into a historical archive, and it's available for the scientists and historians of the future to get a unique record of what did a scientist think about a given topic circa 2025, right? I love to think about, you know, what is a scientist working in 2125? What is their curiosity going to be when they think about what scientists were wondering about artificial intelligence or cosmology or consciousness in 2025? Oral history, in my view, is the best way to capture that, because it's not just the writing, it's the people thinking about the writing. So that's the goal. This is all the things that I do in terms of deploying all of my interview techniques, all of my interest, all of my curiosity about the people behind the scientific achievements to create these oral history transcripts. And with that, I want to turn it over to Sara to talk a little bit about what she does in actually producing the transcripts. And then together, I think we'll talk a little bit about project management, all of the different ways we use the oral histories for these follow-on projects. So Sara, let me turn it over to you to talk a little bit about how we get from audio to a written draft transcript.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go through this part relatively quickly, but I'm happy to answer questions from the notes afterwards or during the Q&A. Just quickly, these are some of the tools that we use for transcription. So ExpressScribe, there's many different softwares that you can use to transcribe, but this is the one that I think is the best. There's a free version that you can use for a while to test it out, and you basically just bring your audio into that software and you can play it in there. And you can also see there a foot pedal, which is a way to control the audio with your foot instead of having to use your hands, which allows you to go a lot faster. So I'm happy to talk to people about equipment and strategies for actually transcribing and software and things like that if helpful. But essentially, it's a pretty low-tech operation with just a piece of software and a foot pedal. And another really important piece that David and I have worked on together is a style guide for the project. And so for each project that I work on, there are specific style requirements or a style guide that the institution has. And I think this is really important if you're going to be doing, you know, multiple oral histories, so that there's consistency in the way you're capitalizing things or how you're identifying speakers. How do you identify when there's something you can't hear? So this is a collaborative document that we create together and make kind contractors who work with me. And so if multiple people are working on a project, just make sure that every transcript sort of follows all of the same style guidelines. And there's many different levels of transcription. There's verbatim, where you include every and all of those thinking words. And then there's other styles where you remove them. And so it's important to just think about, when you're transcribing, what level of detail you need and want in the transcript, whether you need to put time codes in, things like that. So I think, and I'm happy to share other examples of style guides, but this is sort of some of the basics that we use for the Caltech project, for style and formatting. I know there were a lot of questions about AI and oral history, and I can talk a little bit about that. Now, I mean, my company, we don't use AI. We have edited AI transcripts, and especially with scientific subject matter, it gets pretty messy. Most of the AI right now still has a hard time with a lot of technical content, as well as like different language varieties. So if people have different accents and are from different parts of the world, AI is still very like, it doesn't pick up a lot of voices still. And so I think that's just something to consider when you're using AI. I think for certain projects, it can be really valuable, and transcription can be an expensive service. A lot of people in academic settings often will have graduate students do transcription, which I think can be a great solution, assuming that there's training and there's a really good style guide, and that the students have an understanding of the context and the terms and the varieties of language that are being used. There has been tons of conversation about AI and oral history, and this is a symposium that happened last summer, which all the sessions are available online. So if anybody really wants to dive into the AI versus human in oral history discussions, I can share the link to that if you want to see that. And there are some, this is just a smattering of articles that have shown that AI often misunderstands African American voices, and there's a lot of other language varieties that AI misunderstands. So I think it's just in my company, we have people from all over the world that have different language backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different subject matter backgrounds, and it really does make a difference for people to understand and hear and be able to transcribe what's being said. So I think that there are some good AI tools, but you just have to exercise caution depending upon who's talking and what they're talking about. And definitely edit if you use AI afterwards, because it can make some egregious mistakes. This is an example of a platform, an oral history platform, that I actually think is pretty decent. It's called Their Story. So for people that truly do not have a budget for transcription, this is a really great tool. You can bring your audio in, it creates a transcript. It's not a great transcript, but you can edit it after that. And I know the person that created this platform, and it's pretty awesome. So for people who really, like money-wise, cannot use human transcription, I think this one is pretty cool. And essentially with David and I, once I receive the recordings, some of them are a one-session interview, and some of them are, we had one that was like 35 sessions across 3 years or something. And so some of our transcripts, are quick turnaround, and some of them are months or years of working on one person's interviews and then collating it all together at the end. And so we just have a very organized system of sharing recordings and transcripts with each other to make sure that everything goes through the proper workflow. But essentially, he's sending me recordings, we're transcribing them in Microsoft Word, and then they go back to him and then back to the interviewee for edits. And then based on whatever they consented, it would be published. So that's sort of the process on my end. And just to give a sense of, once they go online, like this is an example from AIP's oral history database. You can see all the metadata, you can see the abstract, you can see keywords. And so it can become a very searchable usable tool, even though it is a narrative account. And depending on how you index and abstract it and archive it, it can become a research tool after that. I mean, from the transcription end, I'm happy to talk more about process and style guides and AI versus people.
Sara, let me add two final comments on this, and then we'll end with talking a little bit about Illuminate, and then we'll open it up to any questions anyone might have. The two things are, one point I want to emphasize with AI versus human transcription. When Sara sends a transcript back to me, it is technically perfect, meaning that I do not have to do any additional cleanup work. That's all done from Sara's point of view that you would have to do with AI, right? When Sara sends a transcript back to me, I then send it back immediately to the interviewee. I don't have to do any additional cleaning up unless there's something that Sara has flagged for my attention that we need to discuss before sending it to the interviewee. So the resources that I have to work with, what I'm actually paying for, is that I can turn this around instantaneously. I do not need to get bogged down in editing a transcript, a draft transcript, before sending it on to the interviewee. And the last thing is, what's the value? We haven't sort of addressed the basic question. Why do transcriptions at all? In other words, you've done the recording. Why isn't the recording good enough? And the answer to that is, if you're listening to a podcast, that's great, but that's probably for sort of diversion, entertainment value. If you want to use the information in the podcast, historically, it's almost impossible to search in it, to quote from it, to cite in it. A transcript takes a conversation and makes it a historically useful document, something that people can search, something that people can research, something that people can use for their own scholarship that might have nothing to do with my motivations for doing the oral history in the first place. So an oral history transcript that is edited and made releasable by the interviewee then assumes a life on its own, and it enters the historical record and becomes a resource like any other that a historian would put together for whatever follow-on project that they're doing. So that's sort of the whole reason of why doing a transcript in the first place. And then finally, Sara and I are now engaged in a project, a massive project on the history of Caltech, a century of Caltech discovery. And the concept is, 100 years, it's an enormous organization. How can you possibly, have anything approaching a comprehensive treatment? So we have taken quotes from faculty, staff, and alumni oral history that go all the way back to the 1950s, obviously before I have been at Caltech, right up to the present. The magic of oral history is even though Caltech got started in the 1920s, if you're doing an oral history in the 1950s or 1960s, you can recall, if you're old enough, back to the 1920s. So there are recollections that stretch the quotes from the beginning of Caltech all the way to the present. And it's one way of having sort of a bound data set, a limiting factor. You can't talk about everything. You can't talk about everyone. So if we just choose 300 oral history quotes, we include photographs and papers and essays that sort of provide context. All of this now is going into what will be a massive 500+ page book that will be a really wonderful thing for the Caltech campus community to have. And I would encourage that what we're doing for Caltech can be done for any number of things. It can be done from an institutional perspective. It can be done from a social or public or political history perspective. Again, the whole idea is it's a celebration of oral histories as a way of making a collection of individual biographies all work together to be the voices of an institution. So at the end of the day, this is really a culminating project in terms of all that we have built in oral history and how we're utilizing it for institutional history.
And on the screen, you can see the green is the quotes that are taken from oral histories. And then for each quote, there's narration by David. There's a paper stub in each one that is from a famous paper. There's photos. So I think someone had asked in the questions about sort of how do you put oral history along with other materials as, you know, a more comprehensive look. And so I think that is our purpose with the book, is sort of to put it in context, to put oral history in context with all of these other materials, so that people can see how it connects to all of the other types of records that people would be looking at.
This has been a podcast from the Consortium for History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. For more information on this topic, as well as other podcasts, working groups, fellowships, and resources for learning, research, and teaching, please visit www.chstm.org.